Welcome to Sundays with Jane Eyre. This is episode 12, Nursing Chimeras, covering volume 2, chapter 2 of the novel, which is also chapter 17 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. And once again, I am at the Rosenbach, and returning today as co-hosts are our very good friends, the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. Hi, guys. I think we just have Mary's picture now. Lauren, you're still muted.
Hi. Mary is just having slight issues because she can't hear anything.
Okay.
We're
see if we can work that out.
currently chatting to try and fix this. But hi, everybody. We're very, I can speak for both of us. So we're very glad to be back.
You can represent the Ghoul Guides until we can get Mary on. And welcome to all our erudite Brontosaurs and Airheads. If you are new to the show today, just a note on our format. If you're watching live on Zoom, the chat is for you to talk to each other. Please do. It's a lot of fun. And if you have a question for us, though, put it in the Q&A on Zoom, and we'll do our best to hit as many of them as possible today. We're also streaming live on YouTube. So if you're watching there right now, if you leave a comment in the live chat, I will get to it after the show. And I encourage everyone to go and like and subscribe to the Rosenbach's YouTube page and like the Jane Eyre videos and do all that stuff. It helps us gain greater visibility. Hey, Mary, any luck? Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah. I don't know. I think my microphone's playing up, so I've just unplugged it. So I'm just using my Mac laptop. But I was like, I can't hear anything. What's going on? But I'm back now.
Your video is a little choppy too, so we'll see how we work today. But that's fine. We'll get through it. Well, you can hear us, we can hear you. That's all that counts. Yes. So, it's Christmas season, you guys. Well, first, number one, I've gotten you one step closer to the Rosenbach because I'm actually in the Rosenbach today. And so in a sense, you are virtually in the Rosenbach at least.
Technically our first visit.
So yeah, so we're getting you closer and closer. So your next trip to America, we'll have to make sure we get you here.
We'll just have to do a weekend course and make it worthwhile so we can justify it.
There you go. Yeah, there's things for you to research here. So you can, find the money to do that. Yeah, you can find somebody to pay for the research. It's Christmas
season. Our employers.
What's that?
We'll convince our employers.
Yes, you must go to develop this. But it's also Christmas season, and I am so happy because I do all the ghost stories for Christmas and all that stuff. That's what I really love. It's like a part of Christmas for me is like a mini Halloween here. Like I get to revisit these Gothic stories and all that kind of stuff. I'm in a group too with a library, a library around here. It's all virtual, and we're doing a ghost stories for Christmas book club. And we read Smee by A.M. Burridge. We did an M.R. James story last week, then an Elizabeth Gaskell story next, and then we'll finish with Dickens's Goblin Who Stole a Sexton. So,
which Gaskell story are you doing? Is it
what's the one that we really?
What's the one we really like called? Is
and
it
I
the
think
old
I think it's set at Christmas too. I don't have access to it here at work. I can't pull up the file.
There's a really fantastic one about keep seeing this child and
the story of the old nurse.
That one, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's one I haven't read. So
it's brilliant.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to do that. We'll be talking about that next. Do you guys do the ghost stories and things like that? Do you do anything for Christmas in that line?
We have done stuff previously. We've done kind of reading groups and recommendations and stuff. So we always try and highlight the significance of the ghost story at Christmas and the tradition of the ghost story. Because of course, The Woman in Black, that literally starts on Christmas Eve. Yeah. So that's a good in. So yeah, we've done a couple of kind of spooky Christmas reading groups in the past that have been quite good fun.
I think one year with the reading group or with the blog, I got everyone to send in a kind of Christmas ghost story suggestion. So I have to find it and I can send it to you because there'll be a massive list of a list of some really good ghost stories.
I was going to say, for those of you that joined us for Sundays of Frankenstein, they're not always set at Christmas, but Mary Shelley often wrote ghost stories. They did like they used to call them gift books, like you gave them at Christmas to young women in particular. And they would often be short stories. And Mary Shelley wrote some really creepy, like really weird Gothic stories, for one called The Keepsake. A couple of which you can find online. So any of you that joined for Frankenstein and want to read more Shelley, there's definitely some very appropriate Christmas Eve reading.
You know, the one Keepsake she was in one year, Poe was in it as well.
Yes.
And I think remember
Scott.
What's that? I can't remember the story though. So, I think Lauren froze now.
Lauren's frozen. While Lauren is frozen, I'll just add as well.
I missed that, Lauren, because it froze.
I was gonna say, I think there's Poe, Shelley, and Scott like all in the same edition.
Wow.
For one of the Keepsakes.
Yeah.
And just to add as well, I've made a kind of, as part of the Centre for the History of the Gothic at the University of Sheffield, I've made a kind of Gothic Christmas Advent calendar, where every day like a new kind of window opens, and some of the windows are ghost stories as well. So I'll find the link, I'll put it in the chat as well. If people want to follow along, you can only, it's an advent calendar, so you can only open as many windows as there are days in December.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Lots of spooky things as well, not just stories, but yeah, stories as well, some songs, some images. I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat.
When LaCasta Miller was on last week, she was talking about the Keepsake and these other, kind of annuals that would come out that frequently, featured women writers. And so we were actually talking a little bit about that last week. Pauline asked if I was drinking Guinness, and I'm not. It's my pint of porter, because that is mentioned in this chapter. That is Grace Poole's drink of choice. So a little porter today for the show. I can drink at the Rosenbach. I just can't have the pipe. And Grace Poole also has a pipe. So I thought, oh my gosh, in the chapter where she talks about a pipe, I literally can't have. Well, I can put one in my mouth, but it doesn't make a difference if it's not lit. So there we go. Excellent. So I wanted to, from the last chapter, that I talked about last week, LaCasta Miller, it ends with Jane going through this whole, kind of torturing herself process of drawing this beautiful picture of her imaginary picture of Blanche Ingram, and then drawing her own very simple, plain, self-portrait, and kind of comparing yourself. And it really reminded me very much of Jane still at least trying to follow this kind of doctrine of endurance that her friend Helen Burns had put out, that like, you're not going to get any better in the world, so don't try, just accept what you have and endure it. And I wanted to hit you guys with that today too. This idea of the psychology of this character, Jane Eyre, really seems to be reacting to the abuse that she has grown up with as well, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a really interesting. I do quite a lot of work on like trauma, and it's mostly, I look at it mostly as like a post-war trauma. But what's really interesting I find about this period of Gothic fiction, particularly kind of like post-Napoleonic to kind of.
Oh, we lost you again there.
Very well. Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Brilliant.
It was the most brilliant thing, probably. So we have to repeat it.
I definitely said the most intelligent thing I've ever said. Don't worry, guys. Yeah, so, this period of Gothic fiction is really interesting because trauma doesn't have a name yet, really. People talk about trauma, but the idea of trauma and the idea of, trauma responses and traumatic disorders is still very new. But what's really interesting is in Gothic fiction, you start to have this really in-depth, intricate representation of internalized trauma and trauma responses. And we can start to see this expanding understanding of the psyche and the human condition in a way that is really organic. And I think this is one of the novels that does it really beautifully, because Charlotte Bronte's drawing so much on things that she's witnessed and things that she's, you know, not necessarily always felt herself, but seen in other people. And certainly she's thinking very keenly about what makes a person and how you develop. And I think you can kind of see this alongside, you know, things like War and Peace, or, you know, some of the kind of the big I know this is technically a canonical novel, but, you know, the big canonical novels, like it's a really, really fantastic example of this kind of PTSD before we had a name for PTSD, and trauma before we understood it properly, and how it shapes a person and how you internalize it. And the way that she expresses that in Jane, I think, is really skillful.
Mary, anything from you on the end of this chapter, the last chapter?
I think, I mean, I agree with everything that Lauren said. I think as well, what you get, and you get a lot of it in this chapter as well, is her kind of tempering her expectations. So she's trying not to hope or even to show that she's imagining, you know, what could be. And she's trying to, you know, almost temper herself, put herself in her rightful place. And I think we can, you know, talk about whether, you know, how successful she is in that, in her imagination and those kinds of things. But yeah, this kind of idea that she's constantly aware of her own position and what she should expect, and what should be her kind of, you know, her role and her expectations in life. Yeah.
Is it, do you think, does she go so far as to punish herself? I mean, is it that drastic, her reaction, or is it her just kind of, or is it her trying to cope with the kind of realities of her life? But I don't know. I'm asking because I see this. I see sometimes she's actually punishing herself, is how I read it.
I think it's a really interesting, and I think I'm not going to touch on the religious aspects, because I think Mary could probably say that more eloquently than me. But from a kind of gender identity and you know, internalization and trauma perspective, I think what you get is this really intriguing, very realistic internal conflict between worth and position. And you start to see this a lot in women writers. You see it in the 18th century, particularly, you know, with people like Smith, Charlotte Smith, and then obviously Mary Shelley. But definitely in this novel, you have that real tense kind of relationship between, I know my worth and I know, you know, who I am, but also I know my place. And I know that hope is dangerous. You know, a lot of the fiction of the late 18th century is very much a case of value yourself, but don't be a dreamer, because you could be in danger. And, you know, Radcliffe does that with the Gothic, Austen does that with realism. And I think that Jane feels that really keenly, and Bronte kind of puts that out there really, really openly. I don't know if it's self-punishing necessarily, because she's kind of trying to figure it out. And I think sometimes it's trying to check herself and to maintain that stability, because there's agency and power in maintaining that stability, you know, and not being a dreamer. And if you look at things like Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, that's very much a novel that is about the terrible things that can happen to you if you go with the ideal rather than being realistic, and how to find the balance between living a full life and valuing yourself and being happy, but also, you know, not putting yourself in danger, not putting yourself. And I think it's a very particularly female struggle that can potentially go into that punishing, but I don't think it quite gets there, but I think it demonstrates that struggle really, really well, and that internal tension.
I think it's exactly that. And I mean, if you think back to her time, you know, as a child and at school, that was all about punishment. And I don't think that's what this is. I don't think she's punishing herself in that kind of Calvinist way. I think she is just trying to check herself. I think that's a really good way phrasing it, and to temper her expectations and to just be, I guess, realistic with what she can hope. Because I guess as well, you know, it's okay to have, you know, dreams and things, but to actually hope for something and think that it's really going to happen could then, you know, when that hope is dashed, when that doesn't come about, you could feel even worse. And I think that's what she's trying to do, you know, here.
Yeah. I feel like Jane Eyre would be a big advocate of check yourself before you wreck yourself. Like,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's kind of like her mode. And I think the thing about her comparing herself with Blanche, or the idea she has of Blanche, is that kind of like, we're at a period of real class change. You know, we've just had this huge world war that's completely changed the face of the British class structure, and a lot of the novels that challenge that class structure at this point in time are fortunes made. You know, Dickens does this, Bronte does this, Gaskell does this, you know, fortunes made at sea, fortunes made at trade. You know, we're in this period of real flux, and there is that kind of, you know, well, I don't just have to be poor Jane Eyre because I'm poor Jane Eyre. But if I imagine myself as Mrs. Rochester, I could be putting myself in a situation where because I ruined my reputation, or because I'm seen as being, you know, the poor girl who seduced the lord of the house, I could be unprotected. And of course, there's something in the attic that kind of proves that to be true. If she gives herself over to Rochester's power, there's something terrible that could go wrong. And she also is kind of, you know, she doesn't want to become a Blanche. She's kind of having that thing of like, well, I envy that, but it's also not me, and I don't like it, but I also, you know, wish for it to a certain extent. And I think I kind of see this the way that she uses art, and Hannah could explain this probably so much better than I could, but I think the way she uses art in this moment is kind of like, you know, journaling, or, you know, it's this way of kind of working through your feelings that I think, you know, a therapist would probably be like, yeah, this is healthy processing. Like, this is how you work through your thoughts. And that is really, you know, we talked right back in the introduction about whether or not this is a revolutionary novel. It's not, but it is, because it's, you know, some of those ideas that had started to die down after, you know, the core period of romanticism. That is a very romantic notion, that expressing oneself and dealing with one's feelings through, you know, a creative medium, for someone who considers herself to be plain is really fascinating.
Excellent. Well, that's, you know, that works well for leading into the next chapter. But Bruce just hit me with a question, harkening back to ghost stories again. So I want to hit it just because he has a question for all of us. Issues with ghost stories. He used to love reading them. There was Alfred Hitchcock ghost story collections that he would read. I have a couple of those. And he wants to know who our favorite author of short ghost stories is. Mine's easy. It's just M.R. James. M.R. James is the greatest ghost story writer ever. And, you know, there's everybody else is for me, like, well, in comparison to James, whether they're before or after. But James is my favorite. And he kind of has a lot to do with the ghost story of Christmas as well. Do you guys have a favorite ghost story writer?
I do, but I'm interested to know what Mary's is first, because I think she knows mine.
I mean, off the top of my head, I should give this more thought, but I'm just always drawn to M.R. James, I guess, because, you know, his ghost stories are so fabulous, and really captures that kind of terror, I guess, in a kind of nutshell. Although I will say there are loads of 19th century, specifically like female writers, who wrote a lot of ghost stories that are also really great. I would go with M.R. James as well.
Mine is Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. I love Le Fanu stories. He just had a big anniversary, and there's a new biography out as well.
Another pause from Lauren. Let me know everybody is most famous for Carmilla, one of the
Green
great
tea.
vampire tales in the 19th century. We did lose you for a second there. Again.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, my favorite one is Far and Away Green Tea, which
Green
is
Tea
the
is a good
story about the demon monkey. But I have to give a shout out to, I don't know if you guys are aware that Mary Elizabeth Braddon wrote a lot of short ghost stories, and the British Library did a collection called, I think it's called Face in the Glass, but it kind of did a nice paperback collection of her ghost stories, and some of those are really, really good. There's one about set in Germany about a guy who, you know, jilts his fiance and keeps
We're gonna be hit with this today.
We both seem to be cursed with bad technology. I do apologize.
Yeah. Another glitch, Lauren, and you're not even aware that they're happening. But speaking of those British Library books, I actually just picked up the Elizabeth Gaskell one that they had not too long ago published. So I'm looking forward to reading those this holiday season. Bruce has a part two to his question that now can bring us back to Jane Eyre, and he's just wondering why we think the book has been adapted onto film or, you know, TV, you know, so many times. He says, much like Turn of the Screw, I think Eyre's even, you know, bigger than that one. It's a bigger overall question. For me, I just think it has so much to do with, you know, the appeal of Jane Eyre, that it still has an audience. And when a work has an audience, it will get adapted as many times as people can do that, because it's money. Yeah. Adaptations are about money, people. They're not about art. They're about a production knows that they can make money on this because they have an audience that will watch it. And then hopefully you bring creatives in who can, you know, do a good job with it. But
I think also the thing about Jane Eyre is a lot of the audience is women. And, you know, we think about romance texts and things that sell well. And Jane Eyre, not just because it is a romance small R novel, but also because so much of what makes it interesting is Jane herself, and, you know, specifically looking at it from a kind of feminist angle, it's really interesting in capturing, I think, a lot of women's experience, whether, you know, I think a lot of women, you know, see themselves in Jane to a lesser or greater extent, but yeah, like that female audience is a big thing to capture. I mean, look at the box office of stuff like Twilight, and even 50 Shades of Grey, and it's just a kind of classic kind of small R romance film, but also another kind of story that has that kind of you know, grab and pull. And I think, yeah, it's not, I'm not saying that to denigrate it. I think that's some of its strengths, and why people keep coming back to it and remaking it and adapting it, because you can always find new things in adaptations. That's why myself and Lauren love adaptations, because it's interesting to see what new things people bring to a text, especially one that's so well known. So that's why I would say.
And things need to be updated, you know. I mean, as new audience come to it, they view that text differently, and they want to see their version.
It's also it's a text that encourages a lot.
Well, she'll be back in a second. We know that it is just a glitch that's happening. One more time, Lauren. No. Lauren, I wonder if you don't want to go off and come back on, and we'll see if that can maybe solve some issues here. Lauren, do you want to maybe go off and come back on? Maybe the connection isn't quite right. So
yeah, so I've just reset my internet connection. So hopefully I'm not as glitchy now.
Good. All righty.
Fingers crossed.
Well, let's get to this chapter. And you guys have one chapter to do today. This is your first time having only one chapter, which is nice. Maybe we can, you know, get it done in a reasonable amount of time. It's always reasonable to me. I'd go this show 3 hours, 4 hours. I wouldn't care. But let's move on to the chapter then. And it's volume 2, chapter 2, or chapter 17. And it begins with Jane's kind of feelings for Rochester's absence, in his absence, and how she's feeling. Mrs. Fairfax says that he's probably not going to show his face again at Thornfield. And Jane is thinking, I was beginning to feel a strange chill and failing at the heart. I was actually permitting myself to experience a sickening sense of disappointment. And then she says, but recollecting my principles, I at once called my sensations to order. That seems like a really heavily fraught phrase there, to call my sensations to order. What do you guys, so in a sense, we've already talked about this, but here it is in practice, Jane talking about how she's trying to control herself, right?
I think this opening is really interesting because it's immediately, I mean, there's no Mr. Rochester here, but immediately we get a sense of his routine. Like he's not likely to come back. He often just leaves and then doesn't visit again for months at a time. So here you have a kind of routine, and as we'll find out, there's then a break or a disruption in that routine. So I think as a reader, we can be thinking, well, what causes that disruption, the break to the routine? But also you have Jane's kinds of discussion of like, I need to bring myself back. I need to, I can't be feeling these things. And she talks about, you have nothing to do with the Master of Thornfield further than to receive the salary. So she outlines, she talks to herself about what are her expectations, what they can be, and what she should be thinking. But ultimately, we know that in thinking these things, obviously she must therefore be thinking about Mr. Rochester romantically. So even though she's saying, no, I'm just his worker, I'm just his servant, I'm his governess, there's still this kind of, you know, the flowering of a romance there, which I think is really interesting. And also the line 2 paragraphs in, where she says, he's not of your order, keep to your caste and be too self-respecting to lavish the love of the whole heart, soul and strength, where such a gift is not wanted and would be despised. So I think that idea of being aware of social classes. So in kind of England, the word caste would refer to kind of social classes and specifically occupation. So it's bringing attention to the fact that she is a governess, and ordinarily governesses do not marry their masters, and they're not supposed to fall in love with their masters. But also the idea that, you know, the love of her whole heart, soul and strength would be a gift. And it would be a gift to Mr. Rochester. It's not right that he should receive that gift, but that phrasing of that kind of union between two people as a kind of gift, I think is really interesting. And that phrase comes up a bit later. So we can talk about that later, but it is in this chapter again in regards to Mr. Rochester. And I just think it's really interesting, that phrasing.
Lauren, how about you on this, now that we've got you back here?
Whereabouts are we?
Well, you know, the thing that really strikes me in the opening few paragraphs is her, you know, calling my sensations to order, and but also just that little piece that Mary read. He is not of your order, keep to your caste, and talking about the gift now, and be too self-respecting and to lavish the love of the whole heart, soul, strength. Where such, what is the gift here? I'm a little. Is the gift what she has to give, or
that's how I read it?
Yes, yeah. This is not one and it would be despised. So the gift is what she has to give.
This reminds me a lot of one of the speeches that gets repeated in the early chapters of Mysteries of Udolpho. Emily's father, Saint Aubert, says to her, like, beware of fine feeling, like, don't indulge in grief, don't indulge in sentiment, don't indulge in sensibility. You know, you must always apply ration to these things. You must always be logical and sensible, not, you know, sensible as in sensibility. And this bit kind of always reminds me of that speech, that it's that kind of, you know, take that moment to calm your sensibilities. Like, this is quite a Gothic convention in a lot of ways. And I guess, like we were saying earlier, that theme again of, you know, it's okay to hope and have dreams, but you must be realistic. And as I caught the tail end of like what Mary was saying, but he is of a different social class to her. And whereas in the 18th century, you've got stuff like Pamela that was like, of course you can go from being the servant girl to the lady of the house. Jane is a lot more conscious that it's not that simple.
Yeah.
And that it's not a fairy tale. Yeah. That if she goes, she would be in his power, that she would not be of equal status. She would not necessarily be accepted in society. And what does that mean for her, and where would that place her? And, I think it's quite a powerful kind of, very proto-feminist notion that you can't just be Cinderellaed. You can't just, elevate yourself by marriage and everything's fine. It's not that simple. And it's a very realistic idea. And she's kind of thinking to herself, well, as much as I fancy him, as much as I'm attracted to him and he's enigmatic, I have to respect myself. It's not just going, oh, I couldn't possibly because he's the Lord and I'm the governess. It's a very realistic approach to it. And I think she's
go ahead, finish.
She's kind of, I think she's very conscious of that, is he going to respect her in the way that she deserves to be respected? Is he, because there's that power imbalance, he's not just older, he's also landed and she's not.
But she's not nearly as concerned, or not concerned at all with the age difference.
And it's a pretty normal age difference for
it's not
this period of time.
Anywhere from 10 to 15 years in that.
Yeah, it's pretty normal.
But for her, it's, although she mentioned salary a little bit, beforehand, that she understands her position as, as a servant, employee, that kind of thing, but that's different than caste as well. And that seems to be the thing that's more perhaps troubling for her, although she's of his class, right? I mean, her mother was of the gentry class, and is it her father was not, because he was a clergyman, but it's still,
Yeah, and this is that tension, this class tension that you get, and this is something that the Gothic has been doing since like the 1770s, that you have these men and women who are, so in the Gothic, it's often the sort of what they call the noble peasant. So, it turns out he's actually he's the peasant that lives down the road in the village, but actually he's the lord of the castle. Or, you think she's this person's daughter and she's not, she's this person's daughter and she's actually, higher in social status than you are, and you're on equal footing. We're at a point where money is starting to have more impact than class. You have this huge kind of 10-year spate of all of these families that have been ruined by, libertines and rakes, then by the war. They might be one of the oldest families in the country, but they're absolutely stone cold broke. So they marry the daughters of men who have got famous by selling fish or by trading in arms, and these daughters don't have class, but they do have money, and they reinvigorate these old families. And this is, of course, what Rochester does. His father sends him off to marry some girl who's rich, in the colonies, and he brings her back. And obviously we all find out how that goes down. But this is the kind of thing, it's not so much that she technically is the same class as him. She has no power in that class because she has no money and no property to back it up. And that is where the issue stands. They're allowed to get married in terms of, if she was to have money, she would be of equal standing. There would be no power imbalance. She doesn't. Yeah. And that means that in this new evolving upper class society, she has no power because she doesn't have property, she doesn't have money. And that, I think, is something that she's very aware of, because she talks a lot about salary and money and paying her own way and thinking about her career.
And this is the Reed family put her in this position. It's Mrs. Reed that, even though you're a relation, you are lower than we are, you are inferior because you're an orphan and you have no money. And even though that she does have the blood connection, that's not going to, and then now Jane is
Yes.
forever trying
And
to
of course,
recover
part of the
herself.
problem is it's her father, not her mother.
Yeah.
This goes back to characters like Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. If your mother is gentry, but your father is not, you become the poor relation.
Yeah.
Whereas if your mother is of slightly lower social class, but your dad isn't, well, it's absolutely fine. No one really cares.
Unless her father has money, and then
yes.
everything's okay. So,
yes.
yeah.
But usually it was the mothers that had money and the fathers that had status, because that was how things were working in the 1840s.
Well, Jane's trying to work this out in her head right now, and then as you guys were talking about her working, these things out in her head, this will go on through this whole chapter. A letter comes, and she spills her coffee, or is it her tea? I guess it's her tea. No, it's coffee. And then, and the letter is from Mr. Rochester, and sending directions to have all the best bedrooms prepared. He's bringing all his friends that he is off staying. The fine and fashionable people are going to come for an extended visit at Thornfield. And Adele is the most happy about all of this. Adele ran quite wild in the midst of it. The preparations for company and the prospect of their arrival seemed to throw her into ecstasies. And Jane, and this is interesting too, because Mrs. Fairfax had pressed me into her service, Jane says. So yes, you're the governess and you're not quite a servant, but yes, you're a servant right now. So, and this solidifies her position in the house. She is treated just like the other servants, and having to get everything ready. And her comment on this is during this, she says, I had no time to nurse chimeras, and I believe I was as active and gay as anybody. So it's this back and forth all through this chapter. Now she's got control of it. And I'm not going to, sit here and fantasize about what could be with Mr. Rochester. Instead, I'll just work and be happy as anybody. But of course, as soon as she says that, then she also mentions doubts and portents and dark conjectures, that she's still battling with it. And then, but she says, when I chanced to see this third-story staircase door, which of late had always been kept locked, open slowly and give passage to the form of Grace Poole. That is, of course, bring her back to earth, because she firmly believes that Grace Poole tried to murder Rochester and can't understand. This is her, as Nancy Drew, trying to solve the mystery of the secret in the attic. And then Grace Poole comes in. Stop me at any moment if you have something to say there. But of course, with Grace having to smoke a moderate pipe on the hearth and her pot of porter, I was like, oh boy, I just want to hang out with Grace. I want to hang out with Grace Poole now. So that would be perfect for me.
What I do find kind of like funny, or I don't know, funny, it's not the right word, but we're like, as readers of the Gothic, you're so trained to be like, she didn't know, like there's not actually, this will be superstition or like supposition, like there's going to be nothing wrong. And actually what is up there and what the truth is so much more scandalous and dark than Jane could imagine, which totally flips the Gothic trope on its head of like the explained supernatural. It's still not supernatural, but it's, even Jane, who is like, Jane is right to suspect something's going on, but the reader of the Gothic who had never read this novel would be going, there's obviously nothing there.
You think it's too much? Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, I just love that she uses the word portents and, doubts and dark conjectures, and the whole descriptions about the attic and Grace Poole, and framing it in a kind of gloomy outlook. And, I think you've talked about this whole idea about it being a mystery that Jane is trying to solve. Jane is trying to be a detective, but she's a very bad detective. but you can kind of see there's like kernels of exactly that. It is flipping the Gothic narrative on its head. But she says, Grace and her private solace, and up in her gloomy upper horn, as companionless as a prisoner in his dungeon. And the emphasis on the fact that it's just Grace Poole and she's up there on her own. And, the portent of this paragraph being that is she alone? That's what Jane thinks. But, maybe Jane isn't as good a detective as she thinks she is. I just think it's really, really fascinating.
This reminds me a lot of it's in Northanger Abbey. It's Catherine Morland, right? Well, where she has figured it out. She is certain that the father is evil and has done, like, murdered the mother or something like that. And she's figured it out ahead of time. And then, well, at least in that novel, it's it's a comedy, and she winds up being wrong. This one is, there are serious consequences for what she couldn't figure out. But it's she still just only suspects Grace Poole, and then she overhears this conversation, right? The Leah and another one of the charwomen women are she gets good wages, I guess. They're talking about Grace Poole, and they're not 1/5 of the sum Mrs. Poole receives. So actually, she gets good wages talking about Jane. And then they're like, oh, but not 1/5 of what Mrs. Poole receives. She's making 5 times what Jane is. I mean, we don't know exactly. And then what does Leah say? She understands what she has to do, Grace Poole. Nobody better. And it is not everyone could fill her shoes, not for all the money she gets. So they know what's going on. Clearly they understand the charge, and they understand what it is exactly. They know what's going on upstairs. It is amazing that Jane doesn't find out. If everybody in the house knows, how does
there's a really interesting tension, though, that I think you have picked up on before, in that how much do the servants know? They obviously know that Grace Poole is looking after someone in the attic. Maybe they know that it is, spoilers,
they might not know,
a mad woman in the attic, but do they know that it's who this person is? I don't know how many spoilers I should give, but they
might not know who it is. Yeah,
they might not know who it is. And I think how much do we believe that Mrs. Fairfax, for example, in her kind of warnings to Jane about Mr. Rochester, that she knows who is up there and who is in Grace Poole's charge? I don't know. I'd be interested to know whether people think that Mrs. Fairfax knows who it is, or just knows that there's someone up there.
We'll find that out later. But the kind of person Rochester is too, if he'll tell them exactly what he wants to tell them and nothing more, and they'll have to accept it.
It's a really good example of that upstairs downstairs, because Jane and Mrs. Fairfax exist in the middle. They are not downstairs. They're not Leah. They're not the charwoman, but they're not upstairs. And as like housekeeper and governess, they have a class that the others don't, both in social standing and within the house. So it's kind of like that weird thing of like, well, it's kind of believable that they don't find out, because the servants aren't going to tell them. They don't gossip. You don't gossip with the governess. There's that great bit in Pride and Prejudice when Lizzie like despairs because Mrs. Bennet is talking about Lydia running away in front of the servants. And she's like, oh, well, now everyone's going to know because you've said it in front of the maid. Like, there's some things you don't say in front of the maid, but you would potentially tell the housekeeper. So it's that kind of, it's very sort of what's being said downstairs, what's being said upstairs, and then what filters through in that liminal space in between. And because it's likely that there's a lot of
both Mrs. Fairfax and Jane get to talk to Mr. Rochester. And he'll tell them things, but he'll limit to what he tells them. But the servants under, they just witness and hear everything unfiltered from him because they're just the servants.
Yeah.
And
like it's that weird thing of like, Mrs. Fairfax, Jane and Sophie have this kind of they exist in this kind of weird bubble in the middle. Sophie could be part of it, but she doesn't speak much English. So she kind of, they have this little bubble where there's their Thornfield. Mm-hmm. But then in some ways, the servants see more of Mr. Rochester's Thornfield, because there's there's certain things that you don't mind your servants empty your bedchamber. Your servants do away with your waste. Your governess and your housekeeper, you have tea with them and conversation. There's that kind of thing of they see the dirty secrets more than someone like Mrs. Fairfax would. So I kind of do, and I kind of buy a little bit that Mrs. Fairfax is the type of person that wouldn't ask, that she would just, if Mr. Rochester says you don't ask about that, she goes, okay, because I'm a housekeeper and that's what I do. I accept the narrative that you give me. Whereas a servant is definitely going to gossip between themselves.
Mary Lou just asked a question, but I think we just answered that, why is Jane the only one who doesn't know the real story about Grace Poole and who is really behind the third floor door? Why can't she know? Why can't she know? Everyone else does. And, yes, she says, I guess it increases the tension, but, why, but the charwoman can know, but Jane can't. And I think that's what we're talking about here. This, it's not that Rochester thinks the charwomen could know. It's just that they're going to find out anyway.
And it's the thing, like Mary said, we don't actually know if they know who is up there. And we don't know if they, but gossip will always get around about the dark secrets. But you often, would hear this kind of in society scandals where the daughters and sons of a family wouldn't know about all of these horrendous things their parents had been getting up to, but the servants would know. Mm-hmm. Because you could there's that kind of strange, I don't know how to describe it. You feel it when you're in these old country houses, particularly in England, that there is such a definite divide. And because there's all these weird, corridors and doors and spaces, and it's totally plausible to keep these kinds of secrets from people that live in the house with you. So I think it's more about, not about the telling, but the knowing. Rochester won't have told any of these people. It's whether or not they know someone of the same class who's going to pass that information on to them. Yeah. And Jane doesn't.
Yeah.
So she's in, she's in the unknown.
And it's true that none of them may know who, Bertha is. So in her relation to Rochester. So they may not know that at all. Yeah. There's no reason for him to tell even Grace Poole that. So.
I mean, there was plenty of, hidden siblings and families like these that you either sent off to, a home or a school or whatever it may be, because we're still at the beginning of the times of institutions and asylums. But certainly there were families who had relatives with, madness, which was sometimes just epilepsy, or they were deaf, in an outhouse or on the west wing of the house that you didn't let anybody go in. That did happen. It's not completely unheard of for that type of stuff to happen.
And then the charwoman says, doesn't she know? I heard the woman whisper about Jane. I mean, so they even know that Jane doesn't know, and they're not telling her on purpose then, apparently. Leah shook her head and the conversation was, of course, dropped. All I gathered from it amounted to this, that there was a mystery at Thornfield and that from participation in that mystery, I was purposefully excluded. So, all righty. Jane needs to get back on the case here. And she doesn't, but she should have, and she doesn't. All right, let me take a quick mid-break here to tell people, to give people a little message from the Rosenbach. And as soon as I can find my document for that, there it is. No, that's not mid-break. There we go. We bring Sundays with Jane Eyre to you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do so at our website. And since this novel was published in 1847, we're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show. Donations go directly toward keeping this show free and accessible for everyone. And I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who donated to the Rosenbach's annual fund on Giving Tuesday. I thank the people last week. I'll thank you again last week. Thanks to your generosity, we were able to more than double our initial goal of $500. And people who have donated since then include Gemma R. from Red Bank, New Jersey, Christine L. from Downingtown, PA, Diane S. from Philadelphia, and Laura W. from Richfield Springs, New York, and Stephen H., who I don't know where you're from, Stephen H. I didn't get that info. So if you're watching, thanks for your generous donations. But you could also become a member of the Rosenbach. And I want to thank a couple new members. Laura W. from Richfield Springs, New York, also joined the Rosenbach, and Susan F. from Philadelphia, PA. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs. They get 10% off of any of our reading courses and 50% off of any Rosenbach programs that are paid. And lots of great programs and courses coming up. Our new winter programs and courses from January to March are now up online. 3 of them start in January. 1 of them is in person. So if you live near the Philadelphia area, I highly recommend this course called Down the Rabbit Hole, Reading Children's Literature with Melissa Jensen, which takes us from, she begins with fairy tales, and she'll cover Lewis Carroll, and of which we have a huge collection. I think we finished with a Harry Potter book. It runs from January to June. It's going to be a really great course, but it's in person here at the Rosenbach. There's 2 virtual courses, the Poetic Image, which is a poetry workshop with the wonderful new poet Gabrielle Bates, and that is virtual, and that is really filling up, which I'm really happy to see because it's a new thing for us to do. We've done 1 poetry workshop in the past, and I just don't know how much we'll really find an audience for this online, and it's really filling. So that's really good to hear. And we also have Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which has also had a really nice turnout so far in registration, taught by a friend of the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Kathleen Hudson. So I'm really looking forward to that. Remember, everyone, there's Sundays with Jane Eyre merchandise, mugs, T-shirts, and stickers you can buy online. And if you buy something, post a picture of it online, or you holding it, or in some conspicuous place next to your books. Tag the Rosenbach, tag Sundays with Jane Eyre. It's really great for us to help spread that word, especially as we're heading for the second half of this series in January. The Rosenbach also has an official bookseller for Sundays with Jane Eyre, a novel idea on Passion, where you can buy editions of Jane Eyre or order books by Lucasta Miller or Finola Austin or any of the other authors that come on a show. Next week, we have another author, and that will be Sophie Franklin is joining us, the author of Charlotte Bronte Revisited, A View from the 21st Century. Have you guys worked or met or heard Sophie Franklin talk before? She's really great. I've heard her doing a couple Bronte talks. I'm really excited to have her here. And then on 12/26, we're actually going to be off. I had originally planned I was going to do some kind of little program, but not covering a chapter. And I decided I'm going to take 1 more Sunday off, and then I have to work every Sunday till the show ends after that on April 10th. So we're not going to meet at all on 12/26 on Boxing. Enjoy your Boxing Day, everyone. That'll be our little Christmas break. And then January 2nd, we'll return. And Christine Woody will return, who kicked off the novel with us with chapter 1 back in September. So I'm happy to have Dr. Christine Woody back for this. So you guys celebrate Boxing Day or Christmas? Either one? Is like an actual celebration that you have?
Boxing Day is a big thing here.
Yeah.
It's usually when you go to see like the rest of the family.
Yeah.
So yeah, Boxing Day usually is
that how it works then? It's like Christmas, you're at home for a family, and then Boxing Day is when everybody sees each other usually?
I think people depend, but like, yeah, traditionally it's kind of like Christmas Day, you have Christmas with like your immediate family. And then Boxing Day tends to be the day that everybody kind of goes off to like the other side of the family or to see like the extended.
Well, I'm sure you guys give gifts to all your servants, right?
Family, but we get it.
Because you're British, you must have servants. So that's your Boxing Day, is you are taking care of your servants on Boxing Day, right?
I wish.
Yeah. You wish, yeah. Like, yes, I wish I want to be in the feudal society, please, but I want to be on top. That one made Lauren freeze right there.
Yeah, I feel like my experience of Boxing Day is slightly different because my family's quite small, but my parents are quite involved with the church, so Christmas is normally quite busy for my mum, especially now that she's a lay minister, so sometimes she preaches. But Boxing Day still spent with my family, just a bit more relaxed.
Yeah, we're all Christmas. Lauren, can you hear us? Yeah, you're frozen.
She's just gotten
You're gonna have to
frightened by the prospect of Christmas.
That's
obviously.
Oh, is it? Yeah. For some people, it is
Christmas ghosts and everything.
That's it. The thought of Christmas ghosts that made you freeze there, right, Lauren? That was it. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. So,
oh no.
I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. Today it happens sometimes, and we will just power through it. There we go. There we have your smiling face again. Good. So you have to move a little so I know that you're not frozen. There you go. Sure.
I'll just pose every
Yeah. We know what's going on. All righty. Back to the chapter. They're all working to get things ready for the visitors, and just getting it all prepped. And Jane and Adele is going crazy, getting everything ready. And they finally arrive, and it is as she sees them out the window, fluttering veils and waving plumes filled the vehicles. Two of the cavaliers were young, dashing looking. This really turns into like a romance novel here suddenly, these descriptions of them. This is like a Georgette Heyer novel right here. Two of the cavaliers were young, dashing looking gentlemen. The third was Mr. Rochester on his black horse, Mesrour. Mesrour was Arabian Nights. Is that what I was reading? It's a character in that. Pilot bounding before him, at his side rode a lady, and he and she were the first of the party. And this is not the only time we'll see Blanche, but as soon as they appear, Blanche and Rochester are together. Her purple riding habit almost swept the ground. Her veil streamed long on the breeze, mingling with its transparent folds, and gleaming through them shone rich raven ringlets. "Miss Ingram!" exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax. So it's quite the entrance that Jane gives her, in a sense. I mean, as the narrator of the tale, Jane is, herself pictures Miss Ingram. She's the romantic lead princess, in the story, as far as Jane understands how these romances will work.
What I find really interesting about this scene and then the later dinner scene is that Jane is kind of hidden by a curtain, and she says, I could see you without being seen. And obviously, like this is a big grand entrance. But I think, and especially when we do get to the dinner scene, but the idea that, is Rochester aware that Jane will be looking? He knows that she's quite observant and that she's there. And I think that idea that, is he putting on a show? And if he is he putting it on for Jane? I when I was rereading this chapter for today, I just had that thought of, she's obviously trying to hide out of sight, but how well is she doing it?
Because we'll find these things out later about Rochester and how he does, knows that Jane is watching him with Blanche. And he doesn't have to know she's even there. I mean, of course, if he does the big ride up, he knows that people will be paying attention. And why not Jane, one of them? That's a good point. And I'd missed that line. I could see without being seen, because Jane will do this again then later in the drawing room with everyone, where she tries to sit in a place where nobody can really see. Well, first she doesn't want to go in at all, but then she's forced to, which we'll get to in a minute. And again, she's like spying on them, looking out the door as they come out of the rooms, and she sees each came out gaily and airily with dress that gleamed lustrous through the dusk. The collective appearance had left on me an impression of high-born elegance, such as I had never before received. So, I mean, I guess as a small child, she got to see, with the Reed family, she didn't see those, girls grow up and would have looked, kind of done this kind of thing as well. So this is the first time she's seen this, especially being in Lowood ever since. Adele is going crazy and has to watch everybody, and we'll get more of Adele in a little bit. And then because I think I have some highlighted later that I'll ask you the kind of attitude that Jane takes towards Adele in all of this. Then she's listening, right? She goes and she just can hear them in there. Oh yeah, because they don't go down at all this first night. They're just upstairs listening, Adele and Jane, right? And they hear the piano, they hear the talking. But but she fully admits that I discovered that my ear was wholly intent on analyzing the mingled sounds and trying to discriminate amidst the confusion of accents, those of Mr. Rochester. And when it caught them, which it soon did, it found a further task in framing the tones rendered by distant inarticulate into words. So she's just listening for what he's saying and how and what. That's all. I mean, that's all she's interested in. But Adele is interested in all the ladies. And even though Jane has given us a description how beautiful they look, she just wants to hear what Rochester is saying. I mean, he's been away for weeks. How long has it been that he's been away? And the whole time he's been away, she has been coming to grips with, how much she feels for him. And the last time she saw him, they were holding hands in his bedroom for a while. Great. Okay. What do we want to get to now? She sees them again go out. Again, I witnessed both the departure and the return when they all go out on horseback. And she sees Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester at her side. So again, she sees them together. And then she's told by Mrs. Fairfax that she has to come and appear before them. This is that, well, I observed to him that as you were unused to company, I did not think you would like appearing before so gay a party. This is Mrs. Fairfax, right? Could you read a little of that, Mary? Because I find this fascinating. The no, I pleaded off, and he admitted my plea. That Mrs. Fairfax is giving Jane advice.
Do you want me to read from that? No, I pleaded
Sure.
off.
Or read the whole thing. Well, I observed. You can read that whole little bit there.
Okay. Well, I observed to him that as you were unused to company, I did not think you would like appearing before so gay a party, all strangers. And he replied in his quick way, nonsense. If she objects, tell her it is my particular wish. And if she resists, say I shall come and fetch her in case of contumacy. I will not give him that trouble, I answered. I will go, if no better may be, but I don't like it. Shall you be there, Mrs. Fairfax? No, I pleaded off, and he admitted my plea. I'll tell you how to manage so as to avoid the embarrassment of making a formal entrance, which is the most disagreeable part of the business. You must go into the drawing room while it is empty, before the ladies leave the dinner table. Choose your seat in any quiet nook you like. You need not stay long after the gentlemen come in, unless you please. Just let Mr. Rochester see you were there, and then slip away. Nobody will notice you.
Oh, and that's in a sense what she wants, but
I really love this bit as well, where it's just that Mrs. Fairfax being like, "No, he said I didn't need to be there," and it's just really funny. Yeah, but it shows that Mr. Rochester's not interested really in kind of Mrs. Fairfax. He just wants Jane, and Mrs. Fairfax probably doesn't notice that. She just is happy for herself that she doesn't need to be there, and here's all my kind of tricks of the trade of how you can evade all these people.
I love that and Mrs. Fairfax assumes that Jane wants to avoid contact with with these people who she is inferior to, because she is just like Mrs. Fairfax in her own estimation, in Mrs. Fairfax's estimation. So why does Rochester want her there? I mean, is it, I guess, well, they're the questions that come up in my head. Like, he wants her there because he's already falling in love with her, to put it quite bluntly, but also just as perhaps he took her watercolors and showed them to people, maybe in a sense he wants her there so people can see this extraordinary woman. Could that be part of it too?
I also see it as a kind of, I think there's definitely some flirting that's going on between the two of them. And I think this is maybe not him flirting, but him kind of trying to make her jealous or trying to put on a show for her. And the idea that he wants her to observe, and especially his interactions with Blanche, it's all to see how she reacts, I guess, to see if she's the kind of person that he thinks she is, but also to make her jealous and then to see how she reacts with that, and also to show her off. Why not? But I think primarily just to make her jealous.
Yeah,
I think it's a test on both sides as well. It's a test for Jane, but it's also a test for his company. He wants her to witness them so he can ask her what she thinks about them. And we do get the impression that he is seriously considering a marriage to someone like Blanche because, status and profit and all the rest of it. Like there's that kind of, it's almost like the turning point. He's kind of like, well, I'm going to put her in this situation and then see what happens, because I actually do want to know what she thinks. And I also want, as Mary said, I want her to be observed. I want her to feel jealous. And obviously you've got Adele in the mix. Mm-hmm. And I think having the governess and this child there is almost like this weird test for the society that he's keeping. He has a very strange relationship with these people that he's invited to his house, and how much he actually wants to be around them or have them in his house. And him presenting Adele and the governess is a really interesting kind of strange social play. It's definitely not something that would be, in the social etiquette books. Mm-hmm. So it is a really interesting scene as to kind of like what happens and how they're all going to respond, both Jane and the company.
Yeah. Catherine brings us back a moment here to the scene that I want to mention too. Right before this, when the ladies first arrive and Adele and Jane are watching them, there's that whole scene where she says, where Jane retrieves food for Adele in the first scene. As the first scene, we see a hungry child, since the scene's at Lowood. At Lowood, the children go hungry because of a refusal of decadence food. You're all spoiled. While Adele goes hungry because of the prioritization of decadence, in a sense, because everybody's so worried about the guests, they forget to give them dinner, and Jane has to think of it herself. That is an interesting observation there, catch by Catherine, because I never do that. I never think of Adele and the way Jane and the household are taking care of Adele in comparison to all these scenes that we've had of children being taken care of early in the novel. And yet, I guess we talked about it a little bit when Jane's approach to education right off the bat.
It also raises interesting questions about things like class and status and wards. We have Jane, who's raised alongside her cousins very poorly, but should be raised equally to them. And that harkens back to novels like Mansfield Park again. And, we have a lot of novels in the 18th century that feature, is it the old English Baron with Mon Ami and Mary? Is that the one with the Smith novel? Like, there's a lot of novels kind of like in the 18th century that have the poor cousin, or this was my friend's child and I've taken them in because that's the right thing to do. How the servants treat that child is always really interesting, because Fanny Price isn't allowed a fire in her room because she's not seen as being worthwhile for the, you know, the firewood, and she only gets a room. She gets the governess's room when the girls are older and the governess leaves. So Adele's position in this house is really interesting, because if the servants chose to mistreat Adele, she would be mistreated. The Mr. Rochester wouldn't have any, like, you know, they could easily mistreat this child and he would never know. You know, they could abuse this child willingly. And this is, you know, obviously Mrs. Reed oversees it with Jane, but we know this type of child abuse by both, you know, the family and the servants, or by the servants unbeknownst to the family, happens a lot. So this is one of those strange moments where Adele, when no one's in the house, is very well loved, and, you know, she's taken care of, she's treated like a young lady. Adele, when people are in the house, you know, where does, you know, can her governess shouldn't be seen bringing her food, but also, like, why is her governess bringing her food? And that comparison in Jane, you know, obviously the way that Jane responds to Adele being hungry is very interesting, but it again flashes up this unexpected social situation where it's not clear what should happen, and it's not clear, you know, the rules of etiquette don't cover this situation. And I think that relationship between Jane and Adele is really interesting, because you know, Jane sees a lot of her situation in Adele, and as much as she's like, no, Adele, I'm going to be really strict with you, you know, she's very tender with this child. I think it's interesting that you get this long scene of just Jane, Adele, and the other people in the house, and then all of a sudden these people arise, and where does that leave Jane and Adele? What's their situation?
I mean, Jane will notice a child hungry because of her past experience, but also that Rochester wouldn't be aware. But Rochester seems very aware of how Mrs. Fairfax runs his house, and he seems to be able to trust her. And then with Jane, after he's hired her and then finally come home and at least met her, I think he seems to understand how Jane handles the situation. So I don't know if he knows he can ignore even more Adele than he's had before, because he knows that, or at least he believes that Jane will do the right job. And I think if Jane had come in as, you know, somebody who wasn't going to take care of Adele very well, Rochester may have picked up on that immediately. That I don't think he wants her to be neglected. He just doesn't want to have to do it himself or love her, or
it renders his like status as, I mean, it's an ambiguous heroic status anyway, but it renders his status as like the hero of the novel intentionally even more ambiguous, because we're supposed to respect men who take care of their households. Rochester technically does this because he's good. He's got a good eye for people. He hires good staff. He pays them well. He cares for them. He's not a bad master. You know, he makes sure they have what they need. He scrutinizes them, but then once he realizes they're good at the job, off he goes again. He's not a present master. So you have that real weird tension where you're like, well, on the one hand, he's really good, but on the other hand, he's really neglectful, and what are we supposed to make of that? And that ambiguity as well is kind of like, well, just because you've made sure that the person you've left in charge of her is good at her job doesn't mean that you're not neglecting this child. But then you could have treated her so much worse. And a lot of people, it's like that weird thing of like, am I supposed to respect you for this or not? And I think it's intentional. I think it's a very intentional ambiguity, but yeah, it raises another one of those, you know, when we look at it in historical context, that kind of, oh, well, you do this, which most people wouldn't, but you're still kind of crap and absent. So I'm not sure where that leads you.
To move forward again, Tracy says that she always found a certain element of cruelty in Rochester's insisting that Jane come to the party where he knows she's uncomfortable. Yeah. And they have this interplay, Jane and Rochester, this like making each other uncomfortable. She does it too with him. She talks about how she goes to the edge and what she says to him to kind of, you know, get a reaction from him. And I think that's part of the almost the kind of courtship that's going on with them, with the two of them. That he is cruel on his part in that he still has to learn the lesson, right? He's still the haughty Darcy at this point, who doesn't quite understand that I'm not supposed to act this way, and has to learn but in any case, she has to come, and Jane, of course, puts her best dress on, the silver gray one purchased for Miss Temple's wedding and never worn since. Special occasion, well, yeah, because it's the only occasion that she's had to wear it. And a pearl brooch she puts on it too. So, and Adele, though, is her behavior and everything. Here we get, she tells Adele, "You think too much of your toilette, Adele, but you may have a flower," because Adele wants a little flower to add. And then she says later, there a little bit of it, there was something ludicrous as well as painful in the little Parisienne's earnest and innate devotion to matters of dress. So Adele's a little too French for Jane, and for Charlotte, definitely, who we know by Charlotte's letters was not very fond of the Belgians, the French. It's kind of, yeah.
It reminds me of, there's a line in Emma where Mr. Knightley says that Frank Churchill is too French, like, because he goes to London to get a haircut.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, and it's not, he's lying, but yes.
Yeah, like he's lying, but he's like, your Mr. Churchill is far too French. Like, no.
And that idea, the French are decadent. That's
yes.
This is, very much in their the British culture here, that's how they view the French. And also, a lot of, it was nothing but propaganda for the first few months of the decade, or the first few decades of the century, with the Napoleonic Wars going on. And we know Charlotte Bronte, of course, is all about the Duke of Wellington, and he's her favorite, the man who defeated the French. So, but the other romantics all love Napoleon. So, the romantic poets of the earlier part of the century, they all love Napoleon. Anyway. Apart
from Mary.
Yeah, well, yes. So Mary recognizes.
Mary's like, oh, no.
Yeah. So and then they all come in. As Jane and Adele are waiting, all the women come in, a sweeping amplitude of array that seemed to magnify their persons as a mist magnifies the moon. And she curtsies to all of them, and she sees them as a flock of white plumy birds, which doesn't sound that complimentary, but I think in a sense it is, in a way. But it's certainly Jane recognizes that you are a different species than I am.
Mm-hmm. I think again, it's that like tension between desire and jealousy and rejection and, dislike or distrust, that, she accepts being plain Jane, but she still maybe wants to be, it's that kind of, a lot of this novel is about all or nothing. Do women have to be all or nothing? Do you have to be either Blanche or Jane? Can you be anything in the middle? And I think the way, that kind of strange, contentious way that she describes these women reveals a lot about her own feelings, about her own femininity and appearance and situation.
They all come in, Lady Lynn, Mrs. Colonel Dent, the Dowager Lady Ingram and her two daughters, and all the men as well. Any, comments, observations from you guys on the way she pictures them coming in, or should we just jump right into the haughty Lady Ingram and Blanche?
I don't really have anything intelligent to say apart from their just brilliant descriptions.
Yeah.
My favorite thing is the kind of asides that Charlotte Bronte puts in kind of parentheses. Skipping ahead a little bit, but the dowager might be between 40 and 50. Her shape was still fine. Her hair bracket, by candlelight at least, bracket, still black. And then like a little bit later on, still talking about the dowager, a crimson velvet robe and a shawl turban of some gold raw Indian fabric invested her, bracket, I suppose she thought, bracket, with a truly imperial dignity. I just think they're just so cutting.
That is, and
yeah,
I hadn't noticed that. That's really great. That's her own little sardonic comments about what's actually going on here.
Yeah, they're just so good because she picks up on the positives and the negatives.
Because we didn't get that when they all first came riding in. It's just the big grand.
They're just like.
And now she's describing this in detail, but also given the little asides. So, right. Sorry, you froze on that one, Lauren. I don't know if you were saying anything there. I just kept talking. When you freeze, I talk. That's my job. She froze again. So I'll keep that. There we go. You're back now, Lauren. We can.
Good. I don't know what is going on this evening. I've obviously wronged the gods of the internet in
Christmas gremlins. So
yeah.
But now and she notices the haughtiness of the Dowager Lady Ingram. She sees right away her furrowed with pride. She sees her face. Her fierce and hard eye reminded me of Mrs. Reed's. So if she's saying she reminds her of Mrs. Reed, clearly that's a signal that she's not getting good vibes from this woman. And then Blanche Ingram comes in. Why don't should we give it a shot to read? Maybe you'll stay on, Lauren.
I'm happy to try.
Why don't you read that as far as person went? The Blanche Ingram, and then actually those, and then keep going a little into the next.
The genius bit, yeah. Okay, let's hope for the best. As far as person went, she answered point for point, both to my picture and Mrs. Fairfax's description. The noble bust, the sloping shoulders, the graceful neck, the dark eyes, and the black ringlets were all there. But her face was like her mother's, a youthful, unfurrowed likeness. The same low brow, the same high features, the same pride. It was not, however, so Saturnine pride. She laughed continually. Her laugh was satirical, and so was the habitual expression of her arched and haughty lip. Genius is said to be self-conscious. I cannot tell whether Miss Ingram was a genius, but she was self-conscious, remarkably self-conscious indeed. She entered into a discourse on botany with gentle Mrs. Dent. It seemed Mrs. Dent had not studied that science, though, as she said she liked flowers, especially wild ones, Miss Ingram had, and she ran over its vocabulary with an air. I presently perceived that she was, and again we've got those brackets, what is vernacularly termed trailing or Mrs. Dent. That is, playing on her ignorance. Her trail might be clever, but it was decidedly not good-natured. She played, her execution was brilliant. She sang, her voice was fine. She talked French apart to her mamma, and she talked it well with fluency and with a good accent.
Well, we don't like Miss Ingram.
Someone's just put in the chat, she's absolutely a mean girl, and that's a
100%.
perfect description. Yeah.
That she's really, given us the, and it's interesting because Jane in the last chapter, when she's picturing her, and then she's all about making her beautiful and desirable and the perfect kind of woman, and as soon as she sees her, she's just cutting, and I can't help but think that, well, yeah, because you're in love, because she's the competition, regardless of whether you want to admit that or not. Like she can't face that, but Blanche is still the competition, and I think Jane is going to be even more ruthless in describing her. Not that I think she's an unreliable narrator here, but I just think that she's absolutely going to be ruthless in how she sees her. This genius is said to be self-conscious. We had someone asking about this on the Facebook. Adam was asking about this in the Facebook chat too, and especially because that word genius is not really used the same way anymore. That I wanted to hit that, and then the idea of being self-conscious too, I think, is a different concept for Bronte than it is for us. Either you want to take that?
So genius in an Enlightenment term is very different to what we would consider to be genius today, because genius, we quantify the idea of genius. We say, well, it needs to be this, your IQ must be this much and you must do these things. And, there's a quantifiable element to genius. Whereas in the Enlightenment and Romanticism, genius is something much more natural. Mm-hmm. Genius is something that you kind of embody. There's a sort of air and a physicality to genius. It's not just about how intelligent you are, it's about how perceptive you are, how understood you are, and being a genius doesn't just mean being super smart. It means how conscious are you of other people, and are you able to discern other people, and do you have this quality that sets you apart? And genius and sensibility are closely tied together, and you'll see a lot of eulogies and epigraphs and stuff talking about genius. And I think it's Kant that defines it as like the genius is like the pinnacle of human individuality, that like if you are a genius, you fully embody the notion of freedom of thought and freedom of speech, that you are this kind of wonderful entity that is able, thinking about like in Vindications of Rights of Women, when Wollstonecraft talks about the dangers of group education, and that women are rendered stupid because of the education that they're given. It denies them the chance to develop their genius, because there's a lot of individuality wrapped up in genius, this idea of freedom. So genius is something that's used often for heroines in sentimental and Gothic novels, and heroes too, and it's always referred to as like a natural genius, an artless genius. So when Jane is saying genius is often self-conscious, what she's kind of referring to is this sort of higher plane of understanding. It's kind of similar to things like the sublime. And so when she's saying self-conscious, what she's kind of meaning is not like, oh, I'm self-conscious, I'm insecure, or it's that self-awareness. I understand my own individuality. I am an individual brain, I am an individual soul, I'm an individual thought, and I exist within this society, and these are the connections that I have with other people. Because we're still really very much at the beginnings of the idea of individuality. Philosophies like Kant and Locke are only 150 years old. The Burke's Beautiful and the Sublime at this point is less than a century old, I think. So it's when you're talking about self-conscious, it's kind of like, do you have that higher level of understanding of your own individuality and your own psyche within this society? That's supposed to be something that makes you naturally brilliant. Jane's kind of saying, well, she is self-aware, she does understand her own individuality, but she's cruel with it. She misuses it. She sees that she's above, and she abuses that power. She abuses, it's like the acknowledgement that you can have genius without sensibility and sentimentality. And this is something that kind of harkens her back to characters like Emma Woodhouse. We get this in things like Vanity Fair, like a little bit different because it's a more sympathetic, but this idea of being intelligent and perceptive, but without that feeling. And that's something that men are often described as being. You get a lot of villains or anti-heroes in novels around this time, but for a woman to have that quality is quite startling and quite striking amongst the kind of contemporary literature.
I especially like the way she very, as an author, Charlotte Bronte very subtly gives that cutting and reverses it. Like, she was self-conscious, and then the dash, remarkably self-conscious indeed, just turns it all on its head. And that she's just a narcissist. She's not really self-conscious. She's just interested in herself. And I think that's a brilliant little turn of phrase that she uses. I mean, that's just like that dash is just like
the way she then describes it as play as well. Like, she played, her execution was brilliant. Yes, she's talking then about the piano, but she's just likened the way she treats Mrs. Dent to play. And that's such a kind of everything that it's that kind of recognition of like everything she does is constructed to be belittling and to be powerful and controlling in a way that sits very uncomfortably with Jane, because Jane's someone that can be cruel. We know Jane can be mean, we know Jane can be harsh, she's very blunt. She says what she's one of those people, and Mary has seen me do this, where they're honest, but because Jane is quite sheltered at the beginning of the novel, she doesn't always realize that you shouldn't just say the things, some of the things she says to Helen at the beginning, like, you're like, oh, Jane, babe, you don't say those things to people. Like, that's mean. Jane's come to learn that and understand that because she's had the guidance of someone like Miss Temple. And there's that, I feel like in this scene, there's that moment where she's looking at Blanche and she recognizes that ability to be cruel and playful, but she sees the total absence of sympathy and empathy and sensibility. And she's like, oh, there is someone who plays games with people. And I have experienced that and I don't like that. Just because Mrs. Dent is stupid, or because there's that whole thing about, just because someone else isn't genius doesn't mean that you're allowed to ridicule their like ignorance. There's that whole thing that a true genius in the Enlightenment terms is sympathetic to those who are not, and they're supposed to kind of culture and nurture. And that this kind of abject cruelty to someone who can't fully understand why they're being mocked, or if they're being mocked at all, instantly kind of renders her in a certain light.
She's also, Jane describes her as dark as a Spaniard, and the dark, and we'll come to another dark woman later in this book, but this kind of, the idea that she sees Blanche as this kind of sensual other being, not the, perhaps the proper, English person, but something else. And Jane sees her that right away. But I definitely want to make sure we get to this. There's a couple little paragraphs here with her talking about Rochester and how she feels about him, seeing him. And again, she talks, in this paragraph, most true is that beauty is the eye of the gazer. And she talks about, again, Rochester's features, and they're not beautiful, but they were more than beautiful to me. Now she's really admitting this to herself, and it's really coming out now that he's back in the room, and also back in the room with someone who could, that Jane sees as someone who could, marry him. They were more than beautiful to me. They were full. Oh, and about his this is his features, right? Yeah, dark eyes, strong features. That took my feelings from my own power and fettered them in his. She sees them as. I mean, there's this whole image with her being the cage bird later that she says she's not, and Rochester trying to perhaps make her that, but she resists against it. But she's also, in a sense, kind of attracted to that as well. An influence that quite mastered me, she says about him. And it's fraught that master term is. I don't know if I talked to you guys with or somebody else. Charlotte Bronte doesn't see the term the master as a bad thing. Like, she likes that idea of this, intelligent older man who will be her master in the teach me how to live sense, or teach me about things I don't know. And she is very much attracted to that. And she's, Rochester is in that same position to Jane in this novel. I had not intended to love him. The reader knows I had wrought hard to extirpate from my soul the germs of love. Now, she doesn't see germs the same way we do. The germs of love there detected, and now at the first renewed view of him, they spontaneously arrived, green and strong. He made me love him without looking at me. So it's all her, right? Because he's not even looking at her. So this is all coming out of her, but she sees it from him. I'm not wrong, and it's.
She says in the paragraph above, again, you get that phrase, like, I might gaze without being observed. She thinks that he's not looking at her.
Yeah.
And she's, then you have this fabulous kind of description of a pleasure like what the thirst perishing man might feel, who knows the well to which he has crept is poisoned, yet stoops and drinks divine draughts nevertheless, which is essentially her way of saying, to use a kind of 21st century phrase, Jane is thirsty and she's looking at Mr. Rochester, and she's doing it in a way that she feels that she can do it without repercussions because he's not looking at her. And her looking at him without that kind of, exchange of glances is just showing how amazingly beautiful in her way she finds him, and how attractive she finds him, and how he has mastered her. And again, we can think about, well, is Mr. Rochester looking at her? And I think, obviously he is.
He's aware that she's looking at him.
Yeah, he's definitely aware that she's gazing, and that, I think, when you realize that, also gives this a different kind of texture to it, with the idea that he knows that she's looking, and maybe he likes that, or maybe he wants to give her opportunities to look. It's a really fascinating passage.
It also, we have temporal disruption here, because we go from, for the most part, Jane tells the story in the past tense, and she only speaks in the present tense when she's talking directly to the reader in an aside. And all of a sudden we go from, they did, this did, to at last coffee is brought in, I sit in the shade. And then when Rochester appears again, it's not like, oh, and then he walked in. It's he comes in last. I am not looking at the arch, yet I see him enter. We go from this like conscious storytelling to a very powerful in the moment recollection. That shift in narrative style is huge. You go from, I am Jane and I am the storyteller and I'm in control of my tale and I tell you this story, to I'm remembering this moment when I, as an 18-year-old girl, suddenly realized powerfully that I was in love with this man. And rather than telling you the story, I'm lapsing into reliving the memory and telling it to you as if it's happening to me right now, as if I'm sat in that room, slightly behind that curtain, watching this happen and having this realization. And that shift in narrative and tense, I think, just betrays so much emotion, and it's very conscious, because Jane's storytelling style is so controlled, so intentional. She has such a recognizable voice, and it's quite jarring to go from that to this. And I think playing with that idea of temporal disruption and of I said right at the beginning, when you're reading this novel, remember that you're being told this story, that you're consciously, this is a narrator telling you the story. And this is such a fantastic moment of what as an author can we do with first person narrative that we can't do with third person narrative. You can't capture this type of emotion in third person narrative because you're describing something, whereas having this shift to, I see him, I watch him, and then describing this intense realization of love, particularly when we think about the fact that, this is a young girl, this is like a first major moment in her life. I don't think that we've really ever gotten anything like that in literature up until this point. Like, this is such a revolutionary moment in text that an author, a female author, is playing with the novel form and the first person form to represent female feeling, female psyche, a woman's, perception in such an intense way. And I think the kind of gender dynamic that we have here.
Oh, lost the end of that. Mary?
Yeah, I mean, the gender dynamic is very interesting. I'm not sure where Lauren was going with that, but there is that idea. I think someone's just put in the chat the idea that of the power dynamic, and there is that here as well. And the idea that, to look at Mr. Rochester and to love Mr. Rochester is a kind of is poisoned in some way. There is the idea that, yes, this is a woman's kinds of feelings and the kernel or the germ of love. This is obviously her looking back, recollecting the first moment that she realized, I love this man. But there's also something poisonous about it, and I think it is interesting that she uses that word as well. It's kind of, this is a really powerful, intense moment, but there is something there that we have to be careful about.
All right.
Don't know if that's what Lauren was going to say, but
that was exact. Well, yeah, she came back and she's present again. We'll have to get through this though. But yeah, and then she is really, investing now. He is not, and she even says, he is not to them what he is to me. I mean, she's really claiming him for herself now. He is not of their kind. I believe he is of mine. I am sure he is. I feel akin to him. I understand the language of his countenance and movements. I mean, this is, her finally about now I can fully invest. I mean, I don't know what's given her permission to do so already. Or at this point, but she does seem to hit that moment now. I must then repeat continually that we are forever, but then, that we're sundered, yet while I live and think I must love him, that, she's gonna, she's in a position where I'm going to deal with the situation where I can't have you, but I must love him. Hey, Lauren, you back now? Good. Nope, it's not working. We're gonna and then we have this well, I mean, we're up against the time anyway, but this whole interchange, there we go. Maybe we'll hold on to you this time a little. Then we have this Jane gets to watch Blanche and Rochester go through this, well, what appears to be courtship on both of their parts. But I think later in the novel, we realize that Rochester's not really interested in her.
I think as well, what Lauren said earlier about genius and the idea of Blanche playing, I think you get that here as well. And I think because you've read that paragraph about Blanche and how cruel she can be, I think you can see that here with the way that Blanche is manipulating everyone in the room. It's like she's waiting for Mr. Rochester to be free to go up to him and then to mention, the conversation about the governess and to bring in her mother and to mention this, she's very purposeful. She's very self-conscious in the actions that she does and drawing out the responses that she wants and controlling that conversation because she thinks this is a way to put Jane Eyre, the governess, down and therefore to raise up herself. And obviously we know later, but I think you can kind of see it in this scene anyway, that maybe Mr. Rochester and isn't necessarily agreeing with Blanche and the idea that he's testing, we said, maybe he's testing Jane, but also maybe he's seeing what other people are like. If he's viewing Blanche as a potential suitor, someone that he could marry, what's she going to be like interacting with Adele and Jane? And, you know,
somebody earlier, Mary Lou mentioned in the Q&A, like, well, he can't marry Blanche either. What's he going to do there? So, you know, but we don't know that yet. So what would he have done is we can't go down that road. But as if we weren't already, you know, predisposed to not like Blanche as Jane doesn't, then then Blanche goes on, and the other women there too, on this whole, you know, rant against governesses, the whole tribe of them. And then we get to really see how awful they are, and how awful they've been since they were little children, and how it's reinforced by their parents. But this is also the issue that goes through the first, or at least the Anne Bronte novels and the Charlotte Bronte novels, is the plight of the governess, and how they both had this experience in their life, and they both put it in their novels, you know.
It also really reminds me of when, you know, when you take a friend or a partner out to a restaurant, and, you know, you just see how they are with service workers, with, you know, with the hostess, the waiters, the staff, or any kind of place where there is that kind of, you know, in a shop or in a hotel, and the idea of how do the people that you're with treat people in, you know, service workers. And Blanche is doing that thing where, oh, I'm going to impress him by talking down and you know, making a fuss and being really cruel. But I think we, as the reader, and Jane and Mr. Rochester, are kind of that person, you know, sat at the other side of the table thinking, oh my God, like, this is awful. You don't treat, even, you know, even in this case where there is a kind of hierarchy in terms of class, you don't treat people who are of a lower social class that way. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Let's wrap this up. And that Jane finally gets to duck out of the room, and she thinks she's, you know, getting away. And then Rochester takes the time to leave and kind of intercept her in the hallway, and questions her again, as he did. Why did you not come and speak to me in the room? He says she's getting paler, you know, than when he saw her when he was last home. He tells her to go back, and she says no. And then he finally, you know, concludes the chapter with, well, tonight I excuse you, but understand that so long as my visitors stay, I expect you to appear in the drawing room every evening. It is my wish. Don't neglect it. Now go and send Sophie for Adele. Good night, my. He stopped, bit his lip, and abruptly left me. Obviously, he was going to give some term of endearment there. But I like how he's still trying to play this off as, I'm not interested in you. I just want you in there. But clearly, you know, the reader knows, but Jane doesn't seem to know yet that he is.
And he was obviously following her every move to know that she left. She slipped out as innocuously as she could. And yet immediately he's, you know, where are you going? Are you okay? You don't look well. Talk to me. And, you know, it's just that idea that Jane wasn't as unobserved as she thought she was.
She's not going to play the coquette games, right? What's that?
He seems kind of shocked, doesn't he, almost, that he's used to her kind of like sparring with him. And I think I sometimes wonder, does he expect her to do that in the room with them?
He expected that. He expected, like, and all you people, watch how she'll talk to me, but in an admirable way. Like he likes this about her, and she doesn't come through. So
yeah, it kind of I feel like a lot of it reminds us that this is supposed to be a relationship that will ultimately be on equal standing, that this is a learning moment for him. He realizes in that moment that you can't just expect a governess to come in and do these, you know, especially after she's heard what she's heard. And I think it's the beginning of that, like, back and forth education that they will have from each other, that, you know, he's learning as much of a lesson as she is. which is what kind of catches him off guard. And I think that's why he slips up at the end of that conversation, because he's also catching himself unaware. You know, he doesn't expect, we clearly see what he thinks is going to happen, and it doesn't happen, and she leaves, and he's, you know, disrupted.
And that's where we are. Abrupt. One chapter we got to do with you guys today, even though we still ran long. Oh, well. I thought we wouldn't run long because we were doing one. It was a long chapter, though. So
I think that's probably partially my fault, because I think I got kicked out of Zoom about 8 times.
Oh, but we kept talking. Like, things kept moving. So I wouldn't worry about that. That's, you know, technical glitch this week. That's what we deal with. We'll be fine. We got most of your words. Don't worry. Well, Brontosaurs and Airheads, thank you for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website. And if that's how you're watching, thanks for watching. We have a Sundays with Jane Eyre Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook. Join in that conversation. It's a lot of fun. But also go to the Rosenbach's YouTube account where we're live streaming, and you can see all these videos. And if you miss a week, you can go and catch up on them or just rewatch them. Subscribe to the Rosenbach, like the videos, put comments on them. If you put comments, then that kind of raises them in the algorithm. So, you know, we get more audience and more exposure. So thanks to our chat, Mrs. Fairfax today, Brianna, for managing the links in the chat today. Thank you so much. Next week, we'll have Dr. Sophie Franklin, who is the author of Charlotte Bronte Revisited, A View from the 21st Century. We'll be talking about chapter 3 of volume 2, or chapter 18, in which Jane gets to watch the fine fashionable people play charades this time, unbeknownst to Rochester, and as well, unbeknownst to Rochester, a mysterious gentleman arrives for him, and then an old gypsy woman, or is it an old gypsy woman, arrives to tell the fortunes of all the ladies. That's all in the next chapter. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, including our gallery gateways and exhibitions. The Rosenbach is also open, so go online and find out how you can visit. And please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. We're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show, but any donation is welcome, please. And if you are not already a member, I invite you to join. Mary and Lauren, thank you so much. Thanks for working through the tech today.
Thanks for having us, and thank you for your patience.
And I'm glad to get you here. Like, well, you know, I virtually brought you to the Rosenbach. Now I just got to bring you.
It's nice to see a little peek.
There you go. So,
yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll get there soon.
All right, everyone. Playing us out over the credits will be Pleated Gazelle's Secrets. Farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and what you love best on earth. Thanks much, everybody. Bye-bye.